Hi, welcome back to this section on anatomy of a digital camera. As you well know, in this course we are going to spend the next several sections looking at techniques and strategies for taking better photographs. We're then going to spend a number of sections looking at how to better clean these photos up using Photoshop Elements version 14. And we're going to culminate the course by looking at how to edit videos using Premiere Elements version 14. Should be great fun. But I'm sure what you're wondering at this time is, how do we tackle such a big task? How does one begin this sort of activity? Well, if you're the king in Alice in Wonderland, you probably think you begin at the beginning, go to the end, and then you stop. Cool. Or if you're Sergio Garcia, the fantastic Spanish golfer, when asked how he six-putted a hole at the TPC, he's like, well, I missed, and then I finally made. Well, what I think they're trying to both say is that to handle very complex, large tasks, you simply break it down into its components and you tackle one at a time. Well, that's precisely what we're going to do here in this course. We're going to begin by ensuring by this section that we are all starting with the same vocabulary when it comes to our cameras. Without this, it's going to be impossible for us to meaningfully speak about taking better photos or touching up photos, because we're going to be working on different vocabularies. So let's jump into the anatomy of a digital camera such that we can all assure that going forward we're speaking the same voice. All right, let's go. All right, what we're looking at here is a schematic of a digital camera. And we're going to start by talking about the camera body. Camera body really has two primary functions. One is to provide a temperature and moisture proof environment for the rest of our components. And two is to keep unwanted light out of our camera. We're going to spend a lot of time worrying in the next few sections about the amount of light getting into the sensor. The camera body assures us that extraneous light isn't part of that light system. All right, very good. The next major component we're going to discuss is the lens. The lens and the sensor is where you're going to spend your money on a good camera. It's because it's what's going to determine the quality, ultimately determine the quality of your pictures, assuming all the rest is done properly. Lens also performs a couple of different functions. One is it allows you to zoom in or zoom out. Zoom in and zoom out really does nothing other than change what is known as the focal point. Focal point is that point in space or a distance away from the camera at which everything is in perfect focus. You zoom in, that focal point becomes closer. You zoom out, it goes further away. Easy peasy. All right, the second function of the lens is to ensure that your subject is properly focused on the sensor. You're going to do this through a series of lenses in there that allow you to change the relative position of the image on the sensor, thus getting it in focus. Easy enough. Okay, a couple of things to think about with respect to the lens. One important one is that Photoshop can fix an exposure problem. It can help you crop and help you improve the composition of your image. What it doesn't do a very good job of is fixing focus problems. So please be certain that you know how to change the focus on your camera lens such that that image is in perfect sharpness on the sensor. Two, and that's important as well, and that is as you change the zoom distance or the focal length on your camera lens, you also change the relative area over which your image is being created. Take, for example, these two shots of some buffalo out in Custer State Park, South Dakota. When we're zoomed way out, a relatively large geographic area is part of our composition. We're seeing all the little buffalo as big whole herd and all the rest. However, when we zoom way in, all we're really seeing is this big bull's head. Keep that in mind as you're composing your image, that your zoom becomes really a very important part of your composition toolbox. Okay. All right, one final thing with respect to zoom. Many people think that you only zoom in on distant objects. I strongly disagree. Take a look at this shot of a tulip, which my wife took up in Chicago this spring. Fantastic composition, gorgeous shot. And this image was probably taken fully zoomed in, but only 6, 8, 10 inches from the end of the camera lens. So keep that in mind again as we're doing composition. It's going to be important. All right, our next major component is the sensor. The sensor is really nothing more than a transducer which converts light coming into the camera to a known electrical impulse. That known electrical impulse can then be converted by the onboard computer chip to a JPEG. JPEG is the standard that 99% of us are going to use. Given that we now know that the sensor is really nothing more than a vast array of electrical transducers converting light to electrical pulse, we can also help to understand the difference between a 13 and a 3 megapixel camera. Really, it's nothing more than the number of transducers on that sensory array. Alrighty, our next major component is the shutter. The shutter controls the amount of time light is allowed to get onto the sensor. Shutter speeds are measured in seconds. Fast shutter speeds are down in the 1/250th, 1/500th of a second. Very slow shutter speeds might be as long as even a second or two. We're going to talk about shutter speeds when we talk about exposure, so be prepared to know how to control the shutter speed of your camera for subsequent sections. Next component, aperture. Unlike the shutter, the aperture controls the area through which light is allowed to enter the camera and thus impact the sensor. Aperture is actually a round opening through which light comes, and the magnitude and size of that opening is measured in f-stops. Unfortunately, f-stops are an inverse function. I didn't create it. I'm not the guilty party. Sorry. All you need to really remember is that a small f-stop number infers a large aperture and thus a big hole through which light can come. Inverse is also true. A very large f-stop number infers a small aperture opening. Sorry, not my rules. Finally, as long as we're on the topic of light hitting the sensor, there is one more factor impacting overall picture exposure, and that's ISO. ISO really refers to the relative sensitivity of the transducers on the sensor. A low ISO infers low sensitivity, a higher ISO, a higher sensitivity. Check out this image. When we went from 100 ISO to 800 ISO, we significantly impacted the exposure of the image. All right, before this section, we need to take and look at and discuss this diagram. Now, I know this diagram is very intimidating, but hang in there, gang, because we're going to look at it one row at a time, talk it through such that we all know exactly what we're talking about here. Let's begin by taking a look at the top row of this diagram, where we're looking at aperture size. On the far left of this row is a very large f-stop, thus a small aperture size. On the opposite end of this row is a small f-stop number, thus a large aperture size. Now check this out. It also has a great deal to do with your relative depth of field. Depth of field simply refers to the distance over which things in the environment are in focus. In particular, if we look at the top right, we see a very small f-stop large aperture situation. Look at the little image behind it. We see a very shallow or small depth of field. It's going to be a perfect situation for us to take portraits because we want our subject in focus and kind of the background blurred out so it's not distracting. In direct contrast, if we go to the other end of the f-stop scale to very large f-stop, very small aperture, we get a very deep depth of field. Very deep depth of field is going to work great for us when we're taking landscapes because we're going to want both fore and background subjects to be in focus. Such a great depth of field is going to work perfect for that. Next row down is shutter speed. The shutter speed again is measured in seconds. Very fast on the left, very slow on the right. But again, notice that as we slow down the shutter speed, we also introduce blur into the image. Now blur might be something you actually want. That race car tooling around the corner at 200 miles an hour, you want that feeling of speed, so you want a slower shutter speed to increase the blur. However, if you're taking that sports shot of the athlete jumping over the hurdles, you don't want blur, you want to capture the athlete, and as such you want a very short shutter speed. We'll get into it more as we go forward, but please understand that these are two important factors, and as such you need to learn how to control these variables on your digital camera for going forward. Finally, we have ISO, and a low ISO on the left, a high ISO on the right, but also notice that as we move toward those higher ISO values, we introduce what is known as noise into the image. Noise simply refers to pixels in the image that are not accurately depicting the true thing in the environment. Check out this image of this duck on a pond. Highly pixelated, lots of junk and noise in this image. It's not a good shot. I'm sorry, somebody put it up on the internet, but it's not good. What are we going to learn going forward? That these three factors really intermingle, and that on any time we're putting together a shot, we need to be thinking about all three of these factors because they're going to influence one another. Keep that in mind. We'll be beating that horse up and down as we move forward. Again, prior to the next section, I'd like you though to check out your camera manual and figure out and ensure how you know how to control aperture size, shutter speed, as well as ISO. All right, sounds good. All right, in summary, what we learned in this section? Well, what we learned hopefully is how to all speak to one another using common digital camera vocabulary. We started with the camera body. Two major functions. One is to keep the environment out, temperature, humidity, water. We got to keep those things off the other components. And two, keep extraneous light off the sensor. We then talked about the lens, whose function it is to zoom in and zoom out, also to ensure that our subject is accurately focused on the sensor. Again, we'll study it a bunch going forward. Next major component, the sensor. Really nothing more than an array of transducers converting the light into a known electrical impulse, which then gets converted by an onboard computer chip to a JPEG file, ultimately what we're going to store to our laptop. All good. Higher megapixel count simply refers to a higher transducer count on that sensor. We next talked about shutter speed and how the shutter really controls the time over which light is allowed to hit the sensors, measured in seconds Fast shutter speeds are down into hundredths of a second. Slow shutter speeds might be as long as a second. The associated factor being blur. Next component was our aperture, referring to the size of the hole through which light enters the camera and thus impacts the sensor. Excuse me. Measured in f-stops. Unfortunately, f-stop and aperture size are inverse functions, so remember that that small f-stop actually infers a large aperture opening, and small f-stops are going to be used with a short depth or shallow depth of field, as large f-stop numbers are going to infer a great and deep depth of field, probably going to be used for landscape photography, whereas the small f-stops are going to be associated with portraits. Finally, we talked about ISO, the relative sensitivity of the sensors, and how that number increases. So does noise on the image. Noise simply representing inaccurately represented pixels from the environment. We want to avoid it, is the short answer. All right, that pretty much covers the anatomy of a digital camera. I'm looking forward to our next section when we finally start looking at some strategies and techniques for taking better photographs. So we'll see you in that one. And remember, in the interim, keep on learning.